My name is Nathan Cole, and at 34 years old I returned to the same neighborhood where she had grown up in Charlotte, Carolina from the north, for a reason that wasn't particularly dramatic, but which had within it that specific mixture of tiredness and nostalgia that pushes people back to those places, whom they knew before things became complicated. I had spent 8 years in Atlanta working for a company, civil engineering firm that built bridges, viaducts, and structures. That remained standing for decades after you forgot that I had participated in their construction. It was good work, of the kind that satisfies that part of the brain that needs to see concrete and lasting results. But Atlanta had... The tornado was too big for me in a way that took me a while to name it, and when I named it, it was with some relief, because having a name for a discomfort is already half the battle. Do something about it. The discomfort was called loneliness, not dramatic loneliness. From the films, it wasn't profound isolation, it was subtle loneliness, of living in a huge city full of people and events and of possibilities, and still going home every night for an apartment that had never become completely yours, which was inhabited but not truly inhabited, like a long-term hotel where you learn where the IT plugs in electrical outlets, but never hangs anything on the walls. My mother, Sandra Cole, still lived in Charlotte. My father, Robert, had died when I was 26 years old, a heart attack that didn't give enough warning so that no one noticed. She was getting ready, and my mother had stayed at the house where we were. They were created in the Dilworth neighborhood, on a street with old trees, and uneven sidewalks and neighbors who still knew each other by name. I used to visit on holidays and vacations, and sometimes on a weekend off, and every time I arrived, there was a specific moment of rest that childhood places. They offer them when they are still intact enough. So my company opened an office in Charlotte and me. He offered the transfer, and I said yes before finishing, to hear the full proposal. I rented an apartment in a 3-story building on the same street. The street where my mother lived, 2 blocks from her, which it was a calculated proximity, designed to be close without being an adult son who returned to his childhood bedroom. The building. It was old but well maintained, with that personality of a building that survived decades of Charlotte growing around her and which now existed in a comfortable state. Anachronism, surrounded by newer and simpler buildings, but solid in a way they weren't before. I moved in September, on a still intensely hot afternoon, but with that specific scent of autumn arriving that Carolina North has before any other visible sign of change. Seasonal. It took me 2 days to organize the apartment. Who was on the second floor, and at the end of the second day I was sitting on the porch with a cold beer, looking at the street with that feeling of belonging that I hadn't had before. In Atlanta for 8 years. It was there on that balcony, at the end of the second day, that I saw my neighbor for the first time. She left through the gate of the apartment next to mine, which I still didn't know it was hers, carrying 2 bags of large supermarket items that were clearly too heavy, for one person only. She had dark hair tied in a ponytail, tall and wearing a t-shirt and jeans, and there was in the form how she moved that specific combination of determination and tiredness that I recognized as the state of someone who was doing the things that needed to be done without having the energy with enough left over for more than that. She was struggling with the bags and the key at the same time, trying to open the building door while holding the weight in both hands, and was clearly losing that battle. Specific. I went downstairs. I didn't make a big deal out of it. I just showed up and said, "Can I help you with one of these?" She turned around with a speed that wasn't normal. From someone who heard a voice, it was faster, more alert, the reflex of someone whose nervous system had learned to treating surprises as potential threats before evaluating them. And for a fraction of a second before she actually saw me, before suing that it was an unknown neighbor and not something that she needed defending, I saw that expression on her face. That's what true fear looks like when it appears unfiltered. Then she saw me, and her expression changed. It went back to neutral, managed by someone who is rapidly recalibrating, with that specific quality of a person who is experienced to quickly recalibrate. "I'm fine," she said. An immediate reflex. Before anything else. Realistic assessment of the situation. "The bags look heavy," I said, without pressure, without insistence, just as a factual observation. She looked at the bags. She looked at me, and there was a pause. which was short but dense, the time it took someone to do a risk assessment that shouldn't be necessary on a sidewalk in a quiet neighborhood on a late September afternoon. "Okay," she said then, with a slightly different version. From the same answer, which this time meant I accept the help, and not that I was doing well. I picked up one of the bags. She held the other one firmly. No. Relinquishing control of everything. He opened the building door with "We took the key," and went upstairs in silence, and she stopped at the door. From the apartment next to mine, confirming what I had deduced, and I passed the bag to her. "Nathan Cole," I said. "Apartment 7. I moved in the day before yesterday." She stood for a moment with the 2 bags in her hands, looking at me, with that evaluative attention that I was already beginning to recognize as her default mode. "Rachel," she said. The end. Apartment 8. He didn't give his last name. I didn't ask. "Welcome to the hallway," I said, with a smile that I tried to force, to make it seem like it used to be, just friendly, just a neighborhood. She didn't smile back, but she nodded in a way, which was the equivalent of a very restrained smile, and it was into the apartment, and the door closed with that click what doors make when the person on the other side clicks, lock it immediately. I went to my apartment and finished my beer on the balcony, thinking about that split second I had seen on his face of her before she saw me. In that reflection it was quick to manufacture, and I thought there was a story there that I didn't know, and that it wasn't my place to know, and that the only thing I could do was be that kind of neighbor, which added no weight to anything whatsoever. History. September turned into October, and October turned into November, and I went learning Rachel Wells, which was her full last name, which I discovered through the building's intercom weeks later, in a slow and non-invasive way, which is the only honest way, to learn someone who hasn't yet decided to be learned. She worked from home. That's what I deduced from the hours she would come and go in ways that didn't follow anyone's usual pattern. I had an office to go to. I would leave early in the morning, sometimes to running, sometimes to the market, sometimes to something he didn't tell me because there was no reason to tell me. He would come back, and sometimes I would hear music coming from her apartment, always. At a low volume, the kind of volume someone who enjoys music listens to. But he was trained not to take up space with her. We would cross paths in the hallway, on the stairs, in the mail area, on the ground floor. She was educated in a way that was careful, not cold, but calculated, like someone who had learned that cordiality was the best shield, enough to avoid being considered antisocial, insufficient to create expectations of intimacy. I responded in the same tone. "Good morning, good evening, how was it? The race, it looks like it's going to rain." The basic vocabulary of good neighborliness, which is also the vocabulary of people who they are respecting each other's space without making a big deal out of it. Fact discussed. But I was paying attention, not in an invasive way, not of a way of monitoring or seeking information. It provided pay attention in the way my mother had taught me to pay it, which was the kind of attention that notices when someone isn't there. Well, without making it a question that the person doesn't want to answer. I noticed that she sometimes seemed tired of a kind that didn't. It was the physical exhaustion of someone who hadn't slept enough, but the tiredness, deeper than carrying something for too long. I noticed that when there were unexpected sounds in the hallway, heavy footsteps, or if a door slammed shut, she would retreat in a specific way. A pause, a tension that was brief, but real. I noticed that there was no one in her apartment. No visitors, no one. A voice beyond hers, no presence that indicated a network. Social functioning around her. I didn't say anything about any of that. It was information she didn't know. It had been given to me and therefore did not belong to me. What I did was be consistent. That might seem like a small thing, but I've learned over time that for certain people, at certain times, in many situations, consistency is the rarest and most valuable thing that another human being can offer. I was the neighbor who I was always there in the morning with a good morning that I didn't expect. Nothing in return. He was the one who held the elevator when she came, arriving without turning it into a display of kindness. That once, when she had left a bag of trash in the hallway, clearly forgotten on the way to work, I took it to the trash can without mentioning it afterwards. Little things. The vocabulary of someone who wants to say, "You can trust this space," without using those words. Out loud, because saying them out loud would be a strain, and not an offer. It happened in November, on a Tuesday afternoon. The moment that changed something between us. I was going up the stairs after work, still with briefcase in hand and tie slightly loosened, the state pattern of someone who had a long day of meetings that it must have been emails. Rachel was in the hallway in front of her apartment, and there was something on the floor that she was trying to reach for, a key or a pen that had fallen on the threshold through the door and rolled to an awkward angle. I appeared at the top of the stairs, and she was bent over, and then she stood up when she heard me, and I was walking past her in the narrow hallway and said something, I don't remember what anymore. Exactly, some casual comment about the day, and in a way completely automatic, the gesture of someone who is used to a certain physical closeness in the tone of casual conversation. I briefly placed my hand on her arm as she walked by. It was nothing. It was just a fleeting moment that people do, constantly without thinking, the touch of emphasis or friendship light, which is the basic body language of social interactions. Normal. She shrank back. It wasn't a step backward. It was something more internal than that. That movement that begins in the center of the body before it, to become visible on the surface, an involuntary retraction which lasted less than a second, but which I saw with perfect clarity. And then she stood completely still, as if she had just finished, hearing a noise and assessing whether it was what it seemed. I withdrew my hand immediately, not dramatically, no, making this a moment of great gesticulation that would pay more attention to what had just happened. Only. I left and continued walking to my apartment with the same natural progression as before, but inside, it had completely stopped. It's not that I hadn't imagined there was something to the story. Rachel explained the patterns I had noticed in months before. I had imagined it. But imagining and seeing are different things. And to see that withdrawal, that reflection, of a body that learns to protect itself before the mind allows it, it was different. It was the kind of thing you see and don't see. I went to my apartment. I made dinner. I tried to concentrate. Something on television. And I kept thinking about that. A second of reflection, with an attention that wasn't curiosity, but it was concern. The specific concern of someone who. He saw a sign that he recognized, but he wasn't sure exactly what it meant. To do it with him, but knowing that ignoring him is also a choice. The following morning, we crossed paths in the mailroom on the ground floor. It was early. She had returned from her run, and I was leaving for the work, and it would have been easy to get through with a quick good day. And each one went up to their side. But I stopped, and I said, in the calmest voice I could manage, the voice of someone who isn't about to make a drama out of it. Rachel, yesterday in the hallway, I shouldn't have done that. Without you expecting it. I'm sorry. She looked at me, and I saw in that look the same sequence that had been there, first seen from the sidewalk, the defense, the confusion, recalibration. It was nothing, she said. Immediate reflex. It was an unannounced touch in a small space, I said. It's understandable that it was unexpected. I just want you to know. I know I did it, and I won't do it again. Silence. A silence that was different from previous silences. You don't need to apologize for that, she finally said, slower than the first reflex. I'm apologizing anyway, I said. No, because I think I did something awful, but because of your comfort. This hallway matters to me. She stared at me for a moment that felt longer than the previous ones. And then he said, in a volume that was almost only to herself, but I was close enough to hear, I'm not used to this. What for? I said gently. For someone to notice, she said. I didn't say anything more. I didn't push the wire. I did what I had to do. I learned to do what it was to let things rest in their place, where they had arrived without forcing them to go any further than they were ready. Have a good day, Rachel, I said, and I went to work. But in that short phrase, I'm not used to this, there was a universe that I didn't yet know, and that she had left behind to exist between us for a second before closing the door. Back. December arrived with Charlotte's distinctive cold that doesn't. It's the brutal cold of the north, but it has a humidity that seeps in. in its own way, which makes the nights longer than the calendar suggests it. The Dilworth neighborhood looked beautiful in December, with the Christmas lights that the residents put up, in the old houses and the large trees along the sidewalks. And during that period, there was an increase in interaction between people, which is part of something that only the old neighborhoods still preserve. Rachel and I had entered a new phase of neighborly life. After the conversation in the mailroom, not yet friendship, not yet intimacy, but with a different quality. Like if the conversation had established that there was something real between, we went beyond the courtesy of the hallway. She looked at me a little. More. Sometimes he would start saying good morning before I even started. Once, while passing by the stairs, he made a comment about it was the first time she had started anything. Topic of conversation, they were fragments. But fragments were more numerous than before. The crack appeared on a Friday night in December, near it was the middle of the month. I was returning from a get-together. It was the office's end-of-year party, maybe 11 o'clock at night, and the building was quiet, with that typical building silence, when most of the residents were already asleep. I was at my door with my key when I heard it. It was low, the type of sound that you can easily miss if you're not paying attention. It was coming from her apartment. It was crying. The restrained kind, not the crying that lets go, but the crying of someone who is trying not to make noise while crying, which is sometimes more painful to hear than open crying because it contains an extra layer of effort to hide it. I stood in the hallway for a moment with the key in my hand. He was hand in hand, unsure of what to do. There was the obvious impulse. Instead of knocking on the door and asking if they were okay, but he knew enough about Rachel to know that this could do exactly the opposite of what he intended. He could do it if she gathered even more when she realized she had been heard. And there was an urge to go into my apartment and not interfere. Who was respectful in one way, but neglectful in another? I stood in the middle. I knocked lightly on the door, 3 times. That were soft enough that she could choose I didn't have to answer if I wanted to. The crying stopped. Silence. And then, after a moment, her voice from the other side of the door, too controlled, with the audible effort to control. Who is it? I'm Nathan, I said. I saw light under the door. I wanted to, just checking to make sure everything was okay. Long pause. I'm fine, she said. The usual phrase, the reflex. Okay, I said. If you change your mind, I'm on number 7. And I went to my apartment. 10 minutes later, my phone vibrated. It was a message. From a number that I hadn't saved but recognized by Charlotte's code. How do you have my number? I looked at the message and smiled. Building intercom list, I replied. It's available to all residents. A long pause before the next answer. Ah. And then, after another pause, thank you for checking. I simply replied, of course. And I didn't say anything else because I didn't. There was nothing more that needed to be said at that moment. That night was the first time we exchanged messages. It was a very thin thread, but it was a thread. Rachel Wells's story didn't arrive all at once. It arrived in pieces distributed over weeks and months, each piece delivered when she had decided she was ready for that specific piece, which is the only honest way that a story like this can happen, because compression and urgency is additional violence inflicted upon something that already existed. Too expensive. What I gradually learned through text messages, and then through conversations at the apartment door, with the 2 of them still in the hallway, and then through conversations sitting in your veranda with coffee when winter was passing and the cold was giving way to the beginning of spring. That was it. Rachel had married a man named Brian Mercer at 28 years, after 2 years of dating that had it started in a completely normal way with that man, present and attentive during the early stages of a relationship, which then becomes something else. Brian was a sales manager, sociable, with the kind of charisma that works well in groups, the type of person that everyone finds pleasant in dinners, but few people really know about them. Marriage had changed something. Not all at once, not in that way. Of the movies where the mask dramatically falls off the next day, to the ceremony. It was gradual, which is how these things usually happen. They usually happen, which makes them more difficult to name. While they are happening, gradualism is part of the mechanism, because each individual change seems small enough to be managed, to be attributed to a bad day or work stress or a misunderstanding that will be resolved when things calm down. Things never calmed down. Brian was a control freak in ways that Rachel took a while to recognize it as a control, because he never used that name. He said he got worried when she went out without giving details. What seemed like care eventually turned into monitoring. He said that her friends were a bad influence, which seemed to be a concern, until she realized she had lost all her close friendships. He said she was very sensitive when she expressed that something had hurt, what seemed like an observation until it became the systematic denial of their experience of reality. And then there was the physical violence. Rachel was careful as he told me this, not because he was protecting Brian, but because I was browsing how to say words that still it was physically difficult to say. It wasn't just once. It wasn't that was the kind of situation that would happen, and she would leave. It was the kind of a situation that was happening, and he was apologizing, and there was a period of normalcy, and she believed that it had been the last time, and then there was another time, and the cycle continues. He studies what he knows as the cycle of violence, but what lies within it? It is experienced as hope that is repeatedly destroyed. She had been married to him for 4 years. 4 years that had left marks that were not only visible. On the worst days, it was the invisible ones who remained afterwards. Bodily reflexes, hypervigilance, distrust of spaces and people, and unannounced touches. The erasure gradual development of the ability to trust one's own judgments, because it had been years since it was said that his judgments, they were wrong. She had left because her sister, a woman named Carol who lived in Raleigh, had shown up for an unexpected visit, and had seen what was happening with the clarity that sometimes only those on the outside can understand. Carol had stayed a week in Charlotte. I had helped Rachel do what it needed to be done, legally and practically. And then Rachel he had left. I had arrived at apartment 8 of the building in Dilworth 6, months before I arrived at apartment 7. I had arrived with little left over. He had sold or abandoned most of his possessions, things that had accumulated during the marriage because the weight of that time upon them. It had arrived learning how to exist in a space that was completely yours. What sounded simple was actually a huge process, for someone who had spent years having a sense of space owned systematically removed. When she finished telling me the central part of that story, one afternoon in February on her balcony with the coffee getting cold in their hands, I remained quiet for a while, letting them to be long, because he had learned that silence after a story like this is not about the absence of a response, it's about its presence. And then he said, "Thank you for trusting me with this." She looked at the coffee. "It's not easy to tell." "I know," I said. "It gets easier," she said, in that way of speaking that it was both a statement of fact and a reminder for herself. "Each time I tell it, it gets a little easier. It's as if words lose some of their weight when they exist. Out of my mind." "That makes sense," I said. "You didn't ask any questions," she remarked. "It wasn't my place to do it," I said. She looked at me. "Most people ask questions it's more about their curiosity than about me." "I was listening," I said. "Nothing more was needed than that. You were giving me." We stayed on the balcony for a while longer, as the afternoon drew to a close. February in Charlotte turning the sky orange, above the rooftops of the neighborhood, and there was a silence between us, which was different from all the previous silences, because it was the silence of two people who had arrived at they were together deep inside, and were resting there carefully. It's important to be honest about what I did and what I didn't. I did it in the months that followed, because stories sometimes, they give the impression that the right person does everything right, and this is a distortion that serves no one. What I did, I was consistent. I continued being the neighbor, always reliable, always saying good morning and good night, and having conversations, that she would start or not, without me making it an expectation, or a record. I was available without being overly present, which is a balance that requires constant attention, because there's a fine line between being available and being a burden. And this line moves depending on the day and the person's condition. You are taking care. I went at his pace. That was the hardest thing, not because I wasn't impatient by nature, but because there were moments where I wanted things to move faster than that were progressing, that I wanted her to trust more, that it would open up more, that it would seem lighter, and I had which repeatedly reminded me that this desire was mine and not hers, and imposing my pace on her process would be a small but real repetition of the type of imposition that existed. I did the damage I was trying not to add. I respected the days when she didn't want to talk. There were days where she would pass by my door with a minimal wave and the expression of someone who is using all available energy to keep it running, and I reciprocated in kind. A minimal gesture, and it didn't turn into a problem. Because it wasn't a problem. It was a difficult day. Everyone has difficult days. And people who are in the process of recovering from something, serious people, have the right to have difficult days without having to explain themselves. What I didn't do, I didn't try to be the hero of her story. This was a temptation that I recognized in myself, and that I needed to actively verify it. It was within me, as it is in many people with good intentions, the impulse to want to fix, wanting to be the person who made things better visible and recognizable form. And this impulse, when not it is monitored, it becomes about the person who feels it, and not about the individual, the person who should be at the center. Rachel didn't need a hero. She had come out of a difficult situation, terrible by choice and decision, with the help of her sister. But it was her choice. She had built an apartment, which was his. He had kept a job. He had established. It was a routine. She was doing the reconstruction work of his own life with a determination that was impressive, when you looked closely enough to see. What she needed from me, I came to understand, was not that I wasn't fixing anything. It was that I was proving it, consistently. Over time, there were people in the world who could be close to her without wanting anything in return, without monitoring her, or to control, without turning every interaction into a negotiation. That there were people she could trust, not because they were perfect, but only because they were consistently honest. I also didn't pretend that what existed between us was just neighborhood. There was more to it than that. I knew that, and she did. I knew that, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest, which she would certainly recognize, and which would be exactly what harm at the trust that was being built. But also not I pushed that which was there to become more than it already was, soon to be. Here was the tension I was navigating, honest enough so that she would know that I cared about her in a way that went beyond the neighborhood. Careful enough that that caring didn't become a pressure she needed. Manage. Spring in Charlotte is generous. The cherry trees that someone planted decades ago on the sidewalks of the Dilworth neighborhood. They bloom in March in a way that stops people in their tracks. And there's something about that excess of fleeting, rosy beauty that it makes it easier to believe that things change. Rachel had started therapy in February with a therapist, a trauma specialist named Dr. Elaine Morris, who was located in an office in the Myers Park neighborhood, and mentioned that, for me, in the straightforward way that had become part of how she talked about things in her life, without drama and without minimization. I started therapy, she said one afternoon at Hallway. It was about time. How was the first session? I asked. Exhausting, she said, and necessary. These are things that can to be both at the same time. They can, I agreed. Throughout the spring, the conversations on the balcony became more frequent and longer. She was talking about work, which was freelance interior design, something she had started as a way to have independent income during marriage. And that had become the work she did from home, with a skill that impressed me when she described the projects. He talked about difficult clients with that sense of humor, dry and precise, which I had discovered to be part of her, that it was the humor of someone who sees situations with sufficient clarity to find their absurd side. I was talking about the engineering projects, about the new bridge, which was being planned for the south of the city, over the office and colleagues, about my mother 2 blocks away. That's where I used to visit on Sundays. She asked about my mother had a genuine curiosity, and I told her about it. Sandra Cole, about her garden and her Sundays spent cooking, and the way she had maintained the house after my father. He left, and Rachel listened with complete attention that she gave to things that found something within themselves. She seems strong, Rachel said about my mother. It's the type of person who doesn't know they're strong because they never. You had the option not to be, I said, which is a different way. of strength. Rachel was quiet for a moment. "I know this type," she said. And there was a self-reference in that which she didn't. He named someone, but it remained unclear between us. In April, on a Saturday afternoon, when the sun had warmed the air, enough to make the balcony genuinely pleasant, without her coat, she said something that was unlike anything that had ever been said before. "You're the first person here in Charlotte that I've met. I feel safe," she said. Not for me exactly. For the air in front of her, for the cherry trees that still had some flowers on the branches, but for me too. I didn't say anything for a moment. And then, "I'm glad that it has come to this." "It took a while," she said. "Things that matter take time," I said. She glanced at me sideways, with that assessing look that was her way of processing information in real time. And then he said, "You didn't get impatient." "It wasn't my process to rush," I said. "Most people get impatient," she said, "with people who are recovering. As if recovery had a deadline that they set internally, and as if if a person doesn't meet a deadline, it's a flaw. The recovery will take the time it takes," I said. "Exactly," she said. And there was a relief in the word that it was older than that afternoon. There was something Rachel had mentioned in passing in different moments that I had listened to without pulling the thread, because every time it appeared, it had a shade that he said it wasn't the right time to develop that yet. It was about the cost, not the material cost of the divorce, which it had been significant, but she had sailed. It was the internal cost, what those years had done to the form. That's how she saw herself, and saw the world. She told me all about it one night in May, sitting down, the two of them on the bench that was in the common area at the back of the building, a wooden bench under a magnolia tree that was blooming in white at that time of year. It was late enough for the neighborhood was quiet, and the only light was that which came from windows of the building and the street lights out front. She said the highest cost had been the trust in his own thoughts, that Brian had been so systematic, and so consistent in saying that she saw things wrong, that she overreacted, which was the problem with the situations. It was always her, and never him, who after years of living in that situation, she had lost the ability to distinguish between what she genuinely felt it, and what she had been told that I felt it. "It's as if he rewrote my operating system," she said, using designer language, that sometimes it appeared in his metaphors. Not from the outside in, from inside out. So when he left, the system that was left was his, not mine. She said that therapy was, in part, the process, to restore the original system, to ask about each her belief about herself, whether that was hers or not. From him, from learning to trust again in what his own, the body, it said, refers to the physical messages that people receive, about situations that she had learned to ignore because it had been said that her body was wrong. "The reflection," she said, looking at her hands in her lap. "When you touched my arm that time in the hallway." "Yes," I said gently. "It was my body remembering," she said. "Not you. But each time an unannounced ring had been the beginning of something bad. The body stores it. It doesn't ask if you want it. That he keeps it safe in any way, as protection." "And now," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "Still keeping it," she said. "Honestly. But I'm learning to have a conversation with what he keeps, saying, okay, I hear you, and now I'm going, to assess whether the current situation justifies this response, and in most of the time it's not justified. This work you're doing," I said, "is enormous." "Yes," she said, without false modesty. "And it's mine, which is the part. It's important. It's the job I'm doing. It's no longer, it's his. It doesn't belong to anyone else. It's mine." There was a solidity in that statement that was different from anything I had heard about her before. Not the solidity of someone who had solved everything, but the solidity of someone who had regained ownership of the process itself. We stayed on the bench under the magnolia tree for a while longer after that, in silence, with the scent of white flowers in the May air, and the quiet city all around. And I thought there was something beautiful, in the fact that that moment was happening in a neighborhood that I had returned out of exhaustion and nostalgia, and that there was becoming the place where I had learned the most about how being present with another person of what I had learned in 34 years prior. There wasn't a single moment when our relationship changed from name. It was a gradual transition that only became clear in retrospect, the way the best transitions usually are. That is, because when they are too dramatic, they usually have within them, there is more performance than truth. What existed between Rachel Wells and me had begun as neighborhood, and it had become friendship, and it had become something more than friendship, at the pace that something more could be, without creating pressure. There were nights when I cooked too much, and he would bring her a plate, and she would stand at the door with the plate. He would carry it in his hand and sometimes invite me in to eat with him. There were weekends when she would come along on the visits that I used to do it to my mother, and my mother, Sandra Cole, who had that type of antenna that mothers develop over decades. Instead of paying attention to the children, Rachel had been received with the specific warmth of someone who understands, without anyone having. It was explained that that person needed warmth. There were walks through the neighborhood on Sunday mornings that had it started as a coincidence and became planned. There was a text messaging language that had developed between us with those shortcuts and references that only exist between people who have spent enough time together to create a vocabulary of its own. And there was that change in the quality of his physical presence. In relation to me, it happened so gradually that I only realized it after it had already happened. The withdrawal. The corridor was being replaced by an opening that was different, not the opening up of someone defenseless, because Rachel I had learned that defenses are not necessarily the enemy. These are tools that need to be calibrated to respond to the current situation and not to the previous situation. But the opening from someone who had decided, based on accumulated evidence for months, I felt like I was in a safe space. In June, on a hot, sunny afternoon in North Carolina, we were on her balcony, and the conversation had paused at a moment from those comfortable silences, and she was looking at the street down there with that expression of complete presence which she had when she wasn't managing anything. And then she turned to me and said, with the directness that she possessed, so much so, "I like you," in a way that goes beyond neighborhood. I was quiet for a moment, and then I said, "Me too. I like you. I have for a long time." "I know," she said, "and you never made a big deal out of it." "It wasn't my place to put pressure on them," I said. "I know," she said again, "and that's exactly it." There was a silence that was unlike any other silence, and then she said, "I need you to understand that still I'm in the process. There will be difficult days, that still I'm learning what it means to truly trust someone." "I understand that," I said. "Not in an intellectual way," she said. "In a practical way, so that when a tough day comes, you'll know what to do. That it's not about you, and you'll know how to stay without doing that. An additional burden. I'm learning this," I said. "I don't have all the answers, but I'm learning at the pace that's possible." She looked at me for a moment with that assessing attention, and then he said, "Okay." And it was the most heavily worded version of the content that expression had had since the night in which she had agreed to let me take one of the bags of supermarket. It wasn't a cinematic kiss on the balcony at sunset, although the June sunsets in Charlotte were genuinely nice. It was just two people sitting in a small space that it had become safe, agreeing to remain there, together, being honest about what that entailed. That was more than enough. There's one thing I often think about when I look at the journey that brought me here, from that afternoon of September, the month I first saw Rachel fighting on the sidewalk, with the heavy bags to where we are now, and it's about the word security, and what it really means when it is used by someone who had to reconstruct the concept of zero. Safety for most of us who haven't gone through what Rachel did. It has passed, is an absence. The absence of threat, the absence of danger, a neutral state that we don't need to actively create, because it's the standard of our experience. Safety for someone. That had this standard violated systematically, and for a period of time, longing is not absence. It is an active construction, something that needs to be built brick by brick, evidence by evidence, interaction by interaction. What I learned, living alongside Rachel while she was doing this building work, was something I could contribute to. I wasn't the builder of this construction, because it wasn't mine. building to construct, but being reliable material. Being the brick, that's where she said it would be when she needed it, put the next one. Being consistent not because it was managing a strategy, but because he was genuinely the one who I used to say it was. This seems simple. In practice, it's more difficult than it looks, because it requires a form of self-awareness and honesty. It's not automatic, but it requires knowing the difference with oneself, between what you're doing because it's genuine and what is doing it because he wants to be seen as someone who does it. It requires recognizing when the impulse to help is stronger. It's more about you than about the other person. It requires accepting that sometimes the most useful thing you can do is nothing but of being present, and that this counts as action even if it seems absence of action. I also learned about what happens to the body after trauma. Rachel educated me about it not through lectures, but for living, and I paid attention. The body stores. The system. The nervous system learns survival patterns that remain active, even when the situation that created them has already passed, because the body doesn't know what has passed. The body only knows what it has learned, and he gets ready for what he has learned to expect. To learn this, it made me understand that Rachel's reflections weren't about me. When they happened, hypervigilance was not distrust, from me specifically, but the continuous operation of a system. Protection that had been necessary and was being slowly recalibrated. Understanding this freed me from taking things personally, which were not personal, which was a job that I had to do it internally, and that wasn't always easy. I learned that patience and passivity are different things. Being patient with Rachel's process didn't mean not to have a presence, or not to have positions, or not to be real. It meant having all these things at the pace that the process allowed, without to push, but also without becoming invisible in order to accommodate. Because invisibility doesn't work either, because you can't build trust with someone who isn't enough a gift to be trusted. And I learned, perhaps the most important thing, that love, or the which begins to turn into love, when you recognize it in your real forms, not just movie versions, don't fix anything. It's not a medicine. It's not a transformative agent that does the work of healing for someone. What love can be, in its essence. Better yet, it's a context. A space where the work that what you need to do to yourself can happen more safely than what would happen without it. And sometimes that's enough. To be extraordinary. 1 year after moving into apartment 7 in the building in Dilworth, Charlotte was back in September again, with the scent of autumn arriving, which had been the scent of my beginning. There. The trees on the street were beginning to change color in the borders, that beginning of yellow and orange, that in Carolina, the North announces the most beautiful season of the year. Rachel and I were together in the way that two people. They are together when being together has been carefully built, and with enough time to establish a real foundation. We weren't a fairy tale. We were two adults with stories and with ongoing internal work that they had chosen to do. Parts of each other's lives with honesty about what that means. Implied. She was still in therapy with Dr. Morris, now once a month. Month instead of every week, which she described as maintenance, and which I fully respected as part of the structure that she kept it going well. There were difficult days, as she had said that there would be, and I had learned to be present on those days, the way she needed it, not the way I wanted it to be, that sometimes it was about staying quiet by her side, that sometimes it was leave and let her have her space, which sometimes meant asking she was told directly what she needed instead of guessing. I had also started therapy in the winter with a therapist named Dr. James Howard, who lived near my office. There were things of my own to work with, inherited patterns from my way of doing things, that my family had functioned, ways to retreat emotionally. They had served me well in Atlanta, and they needed adjustments to the things I wanted now. Telling Rachel, who had started it, had one of the simplest conversations that we had, because she immediately understood what it meant and why it mattered. One particular Sunday stuck in my memory as the kind of a moment that seems simple and that you only recognize as important later. We were at my mother's house on a Sunday in September of lunch. My mother had overcooked as usual, and Rachel I had brought a pie that I had made following one of the recipes from her grandmother's notebook, which she had adapted for the apple pie, with spices that my mother had once mentioned, which I loved. The two of them were in the kitchen while I was tidying up. At the table, and I could hear them talking, my mother's voice, and Rachel's voice. And there was an overlapping of the two voices, a heat that was the kind you can't create artificially. It's either there or it's not. After lunch, we sat on the back porch of the house. My mother, who had that garden that she had maintained for decades, with the specific stubbornness of someone who knows which flowers they need consistency to survive. Rachel was sitting on a park bench, gazing intently at the flowers, complete which she gave to beautiful things, and my mother was next to her. We were talking about the names of the plants, and I was in a chair a little apart, looking at the two of them, and thinking that he had arrived at the right place by way of paths which I hadn't planned, and that was exactly why. The right paths. Rachel saw me looking and raised an eyebrow with that familiar smirk at the corner of his mouth. "What was it?" she said. "Nothing," I said. "I'm looking?" "Why?" "For that," I said, with a gesture that included the garden, and my mother, and her, and the whole day. "It's good." She stared at me for a second with that intense look, evaluative, and then the smile grew a little wider, the kind rarer and more real. "Yes," she said, and she returned to the conversation. I was talking to my mother about the names of the plants. Later, walking back to our building at the end in the afternoon, the two of them side by side on the uneven sidewalk in Dilworth. As the leaves began to fall from the ancient trees, she said, "Do you know what was different about you from the beginning?" "What?" I said. "You never needed me to be more than I was, to justify the attention she was giving me," she said. Most people, even those with good intentions, have a plan. The version of you that they are hoping you will become. And when you don't turn that project around, they disappoint." "I didn't have a plan," I said. "I know," she said. "You had presence, which is different." We walked in silence for a moment, and then she said, "Thank you for that." "No need to thank me for—" "I need to," she said with familiar firmness. Important things deserve to be recognized. I learned that. I agreed, and we walked to the building, carrying the sheets. September was drawing to a close, and the neighborhood was beginning to light up. The lights from the windows as night fell, and I thought who had returned to Charlotte out of exhaustion and nostalgia, and that he had found something here that he didn't know was there. I was looking for it, but it was exactly what I needed to find. Not because Rachel had completed me in some romanticized way. It's simplistic. But why be by her side, in her process? And in my own case, I had been urged to be more honest, more present, more attentive to the invisible things that there are feelings between people who care about each other, of that I had been at any previous point in my life. And this, in itself, independent of anything else, it was already worth the whole trip. Something happened a few months after that Sunday. I want to talk about the September issue because it's the kind of thing, a little something that says it all about how two people get to somewhere. Real meeting place. It was a typical weekday afternoon. I had just arrived home from work. It was on my doorstep with the key. The same physical location where I had been there that December night when I heard her crying. On the other side of the wall. She left her apartment at the same time. Time, with coat and bag, heading out somewhere. We crossed paths in the hallway the way we used to cross paths a while ago. Year, but different from all the other intersections, because there was a year of history within that intersection now. She stopped. She looked at me. And then, completely on her own initiative, without any gesture from me that asked or expected it, she approached. And he placed his hand on my arm for a second. Briefly. The same type of touch that I had done that day of November, and that had made her shrink back. But this time she did it. On purpose. By choice. I didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. But there was something in that touch. From 1 second to the entire arc of a year. From the gathering from the selection process. From the defense to the decision. And it was more than which any lengthy statement could have said. She continued walking in the direction she was going. I went inside. My apartment. And I stood there for a few seconds in the hallway inside. From my door with the key still in my hand, thinking that I arrived in Charlotte out of exhaustion, and had stayed for reasons that exhaustion could never have predicted. and that life had this way of putting the right people in the right corridors at the right moment, provided you were present enough to notice when someone needed you to stay, as long as you didn't look to the side, as long as you stayed, as long as you were the kind of neighbor, friend, person who learns that the touch that causes withdrawal is not an obstacle, but a chapter, and the following chapter is the person who one day decides to play of their own accord, because finally, you've found a place where choosing is safe. This place didn't fall from the sky. It was built, brick by brick, day by day. Good morning for good morning. Respectful silence for respectful silence. Honest presence for the sake of honest presence. And when it's truly built, when the foundation, it's real, it stays. Not because it's perfect, but because it's true. And the true, when it is truly true, doesn't need nothing more than time to show what it is.